Hello everybody and welcome to the Drydock episode 328. This week we're looking at questions from Guide 402 and Guide 403, that's the guides to the ironclads Mesudiye and Magenta, as well as the Wednesday videos on why French pre-dreadnoughts look like they do, and HMNZS Kiwi and Moa versus the submarine I-1, plus a video on Operation Hailstone, the raid on Druk. So let's begin. The Count asks, in hindsight, were the modernised and rebuilt ironclads such as Vasco da Gama, Numancia, Vitoria, the original Fuso, Mesudiye, etc., ever a decent idea, or should the money spent on them have been used on other, smaller, yet more modern ships? I think a lot of it depends on the extent of the refit, and also what kind of threat were they expecting to counter with the newly refitted ship. Because remember, even the Royal Navy did this to a certain extent with ships like HMS Hercules. Now, with really none of these are you going to end up with a ship that's particularly quick. Some of them, like the Vasco da Gama, did gain some speed from new machinery, but you're still talking at best mid-teens of knots, generally speaking. But these things could be done right. Now, of course, most of the ships that were refitted retained their armour in its original format, whether that be iron armour or compound armour. And of course, in the 1890s, when most of these refits were being done, that had been bypassed by Harvey steel and Krupp steel, and therefore was nowhere near as effective. But again, what are you facing off against? If the iron armour or compound armour was thick enough to start with, yes, its effective thickness against newer weapons might not be so great, but say with the Vasco da Gama, starting off with a very substantial belt, that's a belt that's still probably going to resist at least cruiser-grade gunfire. And for the Portuguese, well, realistically, if anything bigger than a cruiser comes after them, it doesn't matter whether they spend the money on refitting an ironclad or buying a new smaller ship. If a full-on battleship comes after them, whatever is sent out is really in trouble. And then, okay, compare the refit Vasco da Gama to a sort of a generic cruiser, and, well, actually the Vasco da Gama, especially for its size, probably is a pretty good idea, because it's got the resistive power to hold off against quite a lot of incoming fire. Yeah, it's not as fast as a cruiser, but if its coastal defence doesn't need to be, and it's been given new and updated weapons, which means it can hit back, and it can hit back relatively hard. So, overall, that's actually a pretty good idea. The Mesudiye, I would say, is a little bit of a weird one. Assuming that you have the big 9.2-inch guns that it's supposed to have, using it as a pre-dreadnought battleship would be a mistake, because it essentially would have no protection against the main guns of another pre-dreadnought, and it also doesn't have the armament of a full-scale pre-dreadnought, even one of the smaller 9.4-inch ones like the Germans built for a bit. However, again, as a coastal defence vessel or a vessel to try and hold the Dardanelles, its planned armament is comparable with some of the heavier armoured cruisers of the period. Now, obviously, some armoured cruisers of the last generation would have even more guns, but I couldn't really foresee that. And because she had quite a lot of armour to begin with for her time period, her armour belt is still competitive, if obviously overly thick just looking on paper. And as we said, the speed doesn't matter so much. So if you were going to use her not so much as a pre-dreadnought, but as a kind of coastal defence armoured cruiser against anything up to and including another armoured cruiser, like, say, the Georgios Averof, then it would make sense, assuming all the guns are there and assuming she's operating in a location where the fact the Averof can run circles around her doesn't really matter too much. The Spanish ships, the Numancia and Vitoria, I'd be a little more hesitant over, partially because they again, are kind of downgraded roughly into the cruiser category by their refits, but their original armor belts aren't really thick enough, in my estimation, to offer a huge amount of resistance against, if you like, peer-level opponents, i.e. large-ish cruisers. So if someone shows up with a full battery of modern 6-inch guns in, let's say, 1902, the original iron belts of Numancia and Vitoria are probably not going to resist those shells at battle ranges, at which point then they don't have the protection, that they don't have the speed, and even if they're restricted to coastal defense, they still don't have, as we said, the armor to resist incoming shells. And yeah, they would have, or did have, a reasonable-ish battery to counter battery with, but if the other side has at least some armor to resist that fire and is firing back with weapons that you can't resist, that's probably not such a brilliant idea. So I would come down on the side of the Spanish ships. It probably would have been better to actually buy or build a brand new cruiser. And, you know, with ships like the British, it's, you know, they had more than enough ships under construction. It was a waste of money. They should have just pooled their resources and built another pre-dreadnought. The man formerly known as Commenting Is What I Do asks, during the Civil War and the subsequent decades, the size and caliber of large fortress guns increased exponentially before advances in technology brought them back down again. However, this was merely for facing off against top-of-the-line ironclads and pre-dreadnoughts. What my question ultimately is, for how much longer could a 20-inch Rodman or Dahlgren or a 110-ton gun go full Blücher on cruisers and other non-capital ships? It really depends on three primary factors, and then there's a fourth wild card. So the three primary factors would be, what kind of shot or shell is the gun firing? A older gun, like a 20-inch Dahlgren, is unlikely to have any particularly modern ammunition lying around, which is going to affect its capabilities to do serious damage to a modern ship several decades down the line. Whereas something like a 110-ton gun, simply because it's designed and built just that little bit later, actually has what we would recognize as a proper armor-piercing shell aboard, which obviously then is capable of doing a bit more damage straight up. Then you've got to take into account the range. So is this a case of, we have a coastal fort, here is a large expanse of ocean, and we are trying to defend it? If that is the case, then the ability of these old guns to meaningfully defend somewhere against, at least, as you say, cruisers and other smaller ships, is very, very much reduced, because then even a small ship, let's say a small cruiser with 6-inch guns, can just rock up and shell the fortress that has that gun in it from well beyond the, you know, the older gun's ability to actually hit, or hit with any great accuracy. The last factor is which particular set of formulas you use to calculate equivalent thickness. Because obviously you have iron armor, which is what most of these older big guns will have been designed against. Then you have compound armor, then you have regular steel armor, then you have Harvey armor, and you could skip from compound straight to Harvey steel if you wanted to. And then from Harvey steel, you get down to Krupp steel. So if you're looking at the late 1890s onwards, your target, if it's armored at all, is going to be armored with Krupp steel. But there are lots of different values given for equivalence. And sometimes there are values where it says, well, this much iron is equivalent to this much Krupp steel, bypassing all the others. And sometimes there are figures where, you know, they'll say, well, this much compound armor is equivalent to this much iron armor, and this much Harvey is equivalent to this much compound, and this much Krupp is the equivalent to this much Harvey, so it's in stages. But there are lots of different competing variables and values for that. Now, they do all fall within a range, but that range is reasonably wide, so if you use an outlier one way or the other, you could get some very interesting values. But if you use some of the more typical values, because it kind of sit in the middle of all of that, what it would suggest is that certainly for a 110-ton gun, like you can see this one at Gibraltar, if it was tasked with defending somewhere where the geographical constraints would force the target ship into the accurate hitting range of the gun in question, which at Gibraltar is the case, then it does have the capability of absolutely monstering an incoming cruiser or other smaller vessel, because at the kinds of ranges that it would be engaging around the harbour of Gibraltar, in this case, for instance, you're talking about being able to penetrate anywhere between 7 and 9 inches of belt armour, and, well, no light or heavy cruiser has that level of protection. I mean, even pretty much any armoured cruiser almost doesn't have that level of protection. So, yeah, if you sail into a couple of thousand yards range of a 110-ton gun in anything other than a battleship, you are in a lot of trouble. And even some of the smaller, less well-armoured pre-dreadnoughts might have issues. But equally, if that same gun was firing at that same ship, but it wasn't in a confined environment that forced the ship close to it, then it would be near useless. And as I said, with the Rodman and Dahlgren, I'm not necessarily sure they actually had as up-to-date shells to use on targets, so their utility would perhaps be even more reduced. But the biggest elephant in the room is that fourth wildcard factor, which I mentioned, which is rate of fire. None of these old big guns had a particularly rapid rate of fire. You're talking in terms of minutes per round rather than rounds per minute, which means that if you were a cruiser or a destroyer or anything that's not a battleship, and you were facing off against these guns, even in confined waters, where you could be seriously hurt if you were hit, unless these guns were also backed up by a bunch of other smaller, quicker firing weapons, you could, in theory, get away with dealing with these guns by allowing them to fire first, ideally dancing at the edge of their effective range and utilizing your speed, counting on the miss, or if you were in a group of warships, you might just go, well, you know what, there's a chance one of us might get hit, but whatever, and then closing the distance while maintaining your own fire during the extremely long period it takes to reload these things, at which point there's a fairly good chance you're probably going to suppress the gun before it gets another round off. And obviously you're closing the range to get more accurate fire yourself. That is the single biggest weakness of these guns, just the incredibly slow rate of fire. The flip side, of course, is that if you are in a full Blucher scenario where the enemy doesn't realise that your guns are there and you're at basically point-blank range, well, pretty much until the end of gunships and beyond, as long as the gun is operational, these kinds of things would be effective. I mean, heck, if this 110-ton gun in Gibraltar was restored to operational capability, aside from the fact, obviously, you could hit it with some kind of guided missile from beyond the horizon, but if, for whatever reason, you couldn't do that, and an enemy ship sailed into the harbour of Gibraltar, even today, this thing being if this was operational, would be able to still do ridiculous damage to anything, pretty much. As I said, the only thing that it wouldn't be able to do damage to during its service history would be later battleships. At least, obviously, in terms of main armor belt protection. Hit a battleship in the superstructure on a secondary turret with this thing at point-blank range and it's still going to hurt. Niels Larson asks, what were the challenges with grapeshot since it first seems to be used in the late 1600s? It seems it would have been an ideal weapon when boarding was all the rage in the early days of naval gunfire. Well, there's two parts to this answer. One, it's fairly simple. The other is relatively complex, made up of various subparts. The simple bit is grapeshot was used considerably earlier than the late 1600s. Some of the earliest references that can be found are from the 1550s, which is about 150 years earlier. So there's that. But the other issue is that even before the 1550s, something like grapeshot was being used, but grapeshot itself perhaps wasn't known by that name. Specifically, obviously, as you can see here, a grapeshot is this collection of smaller iron shot, which is all bound up in a canister, which is then fired at the enemy. Now, you might think, oh, well, surely things like canister and land-grenade shot are pretty much a similar thing. And yes, theoretically, they are similar in as much as they are a large amount of small projectiles stuffed together and fired at the enemy. So that definitely existed before the 1550s and was used in boarding actions. But there are a few other factors to consider. Firstly, grapeshot is a name, and even outside of things like canister, which is made up of normally smaller projectiles, we do have references going all the way back into the 1300s of cannon being used to fire collections of smaller shot than just one big one, so essentially smaller cannonballs, which would be the same kind of principle and then roughly the same thing as grapeshot, just not going by the name of grapeshot, and perhaps not prepared in necessarily this kind of organised manner. There are references, for example, to bags of stone shot being used, which, you know, is essentially the same thing, but as I said, less organised. Then you have the fact that a lot of cannon before the 1550s were firing stone balls rather than iron balls, and a stone cannonball, when fired, can, especially if it hits something fairly solid, shatter into a mass of fragments, which is kind of obviously has a grapeshot like effect anyway. Obviously depends how big the gun is, what range, what it's hitting, what kind of stone you've carved the cannonball out of, etc., etc. But there's a minor factor there. And then on top of all of that, you've also got to consider the kind of armament that ships were carrying. So by the late 1500s and then into the 1600s, ships are beginning to adopt a plan of guns which is similar to what we would recognise in the classic age of sail, where the vast majority of the guns are what we would consider to be field pieces, which ordinarily would fire a big cannonball, whether that be a 9-pounder, 12-pounder, 18, 24, 32, whatever, and therefore swapping them out for, or swapping the cannonballs out, that is, for some kind of anti-personnel munition when the need arises, is a specific thing that needs to occur. However, when you wind the clock further back to the early Tudor period, Mary Rose's period, for instance, and perhaps further still beyond that, you'll see ships supposedly armed with dozens, if not hundreds, of guns. Mary Rose herself, at the maximum, was supposed to have carried almost 100 guns. Henry Grâce à Dieu carried almost 200. But when you look into it, what you find is that actually a relatively small proportion of them are what we would consider to be shipborne cannon by even age of sail standards, and the vast majority of them are small anti-personnel weapons, and by their nature, they usually don't have a solid shot firing option at all. They just exist to spray large amounts of essentially fragmentation, cluster, munitions, whatever you want to call them. Essentially, they are doing the job that grapeshot would later do in the classic age of sail, and that is their only job. Indeed, if you look in the Mary Rose Museum, they have a few examples of that on display, including one rather interesting one that has a rectangular bore, the idea being to spray out a fan of projectiles rather than a cone, because obviously with a cone, a good chunk of it will go too high or too low. The idea of a fan, if you've got your aim right, is that you'll sweep a greater portion of the enemy. And with the vast majority of, obviously, those guns being small anti-personnel weapons, in retrospect, we don't count those as broadside weapons, and hence why Sovereign of the Seas is the first 100-gunner that we count, even if technically there were more than 100 ship-mounted firearms aboard earlier vessels. So if you've got a relatively low number of big, slow-firing cannon, or culverins at that point, designed to smash in the sides of the enemy ship, and you have several dozen, or perhaps even over 100 smaller anti-personnel weapons mounted above you, there really isn't any call at that point to be firing grapeshot or a grapeshot-like shot in the early 1500s or even the 1400s, because you're going to be using your few heavy guns to try and hull the enemy ship, and when you need anti-personnel fire, well, you'd use your anti-personnel guns for that, and also that because they're mounted higher, they're in a much better position to rake the enemy. N990 asks, on the French pre-dreadnoughts video, at 35 minutes and 56 seconds, aside from the absolutely monstrous size that the ships appear to be out of water with all the construction crews piling around for a team photo, is the substructure under the armour made of wood framing and planking? There is indeed a substantial amount of wood planking in the area around the waterline for Bouvet here. And in fact, this is probably one of the best images of illustrating exactly where the belt armor was on a French pre-dreadnought, and therefore where it wasn't. As you can see, basically a very shallow in terms of height waterline belt. Now, that doesn't mean the underlying substructure is wood. We're not talking about wooden framed ships here. The ship is still a steel vessel. However, the armor is indeed backed with thick timber. And this is something that actually continues well into the dreadnought era, not just in the Marine Nationale, but in a variety of other navies. So, for example, if you look at HMS Tiger, when she's preparing for launch, that's the battle cruiser from World War I, she also has substantial wood planking in the area where her armor belt is going to be fitted. And the reason for this was simple. Wood is a good shock absorber. Now, it wasn't really contributing all that much, well, not really at all, to the overall strength of the armor, but what it was contributing was, as I said, a kind of a layer of shock and spall absorption. So in the event that the armor was hit by a non-penetrating round, if it was just steel plate backing onto hull plating or backing on just into the hull generally, you might end up with steel splinters still being spalled off and pinging around inside the ship, and the shock of the impact might start bolts that held the armor in place, which obviously none of this is a good thing. And so the theory went that, well, if you just put a bunch of timber, usually teak, backing behind the armor plate, then the shock will be somewhat mitigated. Spalling possibly will be caught by the timber, which will reduce damage internally. And worse comes to worse, if something happens that badly loosens the plate and it falls off or something like that, then the timber will provide at least a modicum of reduction in water flow. Although that last one really is a little bit more of a hope and dreams type scenario. But generally there were some fairly good reasons for sticking timber behind the armor belt, but well spotted. Ducklin Senmeyer asks, speaking of why French pre-dreadnoughts, why does the ship at 24 minutes 43 seconds have Cookie Monster eyes? Well, that would be this picture of Hoche while she's under construction. And yeah, you can kind of see what you're getting at there up front. This is where the ship's anchor chains will run through, and obviously the anchors will then hang off of that. Now, normally, ships will have two on one side and one on the other. Hoche has two on both sides, which doesn't help. Secondly, they are a little bit protruding, in part because of the slope of the hull, whereas most of the time these things are recessed on most ships. And thirdly, this is an illustration and very slightly over-exaggerates it. If we have a little bit of a close-up look at this colorized image of Hoche from a different angle, you can see exactly the same thing, except now the anchor chains are in place, and you can see, yep, definitely is protruding somewhat, but it looks a little less egregious than it does in the illustration. Captain Vladimir asks, also on the subject of French pre-dreadnoughts, you discussed the French preference for foregoing a armoured citadel in favour of an all-round belt, as well as the assumption by the Marine Nationale that naval engagements were likely to result in a close-range melee. Did French tactical doctrine at the time not just assume this, but encourage it? The all-round waterline protection seems like it might have been somewhat effective in reducing bow hits that would reduce speed. Basically, were French battleships of the era designed to charge the enemy? As far as I've been able to tell, French battle doctrine didn't explicitly call for you to turn around and head bow onto the enemy, firing as hard as you can, and then either ram them or just get in amongst them, even though at various points that was at least discussed, if not briefly adopted as battle doctrine in pretty much all major navies, including the Marine Nationale. But I'm talking in terms of long-term design principles and strategy over the time period that they had this kind of very similar layout in various pre-dreadnoughts. But at the same time, you've got to remember that this is an era when gun ranges, although the guns themselves were physically capable of firing out many, many, many miles, the actual battle range for those guns, in the absence of any kind of fire control or rangefinder system, or indeed in most cases stabilization as well, was still, 500, 1,000, 1,500 yards, maybe 2,000 if you're really, really lucky. And the Marine Nationale kind of looked at that and looked at some of the battles that had occurred in the latter part of the 19th century, whether that be Lissa or various small battles in the western side of South America during the War of the Pacific, and so on and so forth. And they had concluded that, well, if you have a line of battleships passing each other at effectively Nelsonian ranges, well, unlike Nelson's time, when everybody was moving at walking pace or just over that, you were instead, if you're traveling at 14, 16, 18 knots, going to go past each other quite quickly. And if that happened, then someone or other was going to be doubling back on the enemy, i.e. whoever had come off better in the initial exchange of fire. And that would mean that suddenly, instead of being broadside to broadside to each other, you might have your stern pointing at the enemy, you might have your bow pointing at the enemy, you might be broadside, you might have your other broadside pointing at the enemy. And that was assuming you did, an opposing parallel pass. If you did a closing action, then obviously your bow would be at the enemy. If the enemy closed on you, then their bow would be to you and your broadside would be to them. Variations, obviously, on that theme. And also, if you sort of fell in with each other where you're in parallel but both going in the same direction, you might try and maneuver for advantage or to maneuver against disadvantage. So you might try and maneuver to cut off a portion of the enemy fleet, or you might maneuver because there were torpedoes in the water. And all of that amounted to them concluding that in battle, while it would be nice to be broadside on and bring maximum firepower to bear, given that obviously a ship is quite long compared to its beam at this stage in ship development, the simple fact was that there was probably going to be a decent amount of time in the overall scheme of things where that wasn't going to be the case, and you were going to be quarter on or bow on, and therefore logically, if you're going to be fighting at pretty much all points at random in the middle of a battle, it makes sense to be protected as best you can at all points and have as much firepower as best you can at all points, hence the diamond-shaped gun layout and hence the all-round belt armour. As I said, there was a certain logic to it all. About the only major flaw with the plan, at least as far as pre-dreadnought combat stood in the late 1880s and early 1890s, or ironclad, I suppose, in the late 1880s, was the fact that as doing that, especially before the advent of Harvey and Krupp steel, meant that your belt had to be very, very shallow, which meant the vast majority of your ship wasn't able to be protected, especially above water, and of course the tumble home with its effects on stability. So yeah, it might make sense at the beginning of a fight, but the design compromises made for it meant that if you actually started getting hit, even if it was only by the aft or fore twin guns of your opponent, you could end up in a bad way very fast. Edward Dunn asks, the wreck of HMS Orpheus in Manukau Harbour in 1863 can be attributed to the use of a chart that was out of date to enter the harbour, despite an updated chart being available on board. The out-of-date chart was from 1856, with the updated one being made in 1861. My question is, just how frequently were charts updated in the Royal Navy during the period between the end of the Napoleonic Wars and the beginning of World War I? Charts being updated by the Hydrographic Office and the Royal Navy varied quite considerably depending on what kind of chart and where. So the really large charts that showed you big sections of coastline weren't usually that frequently updated, mostly because the coastline didn't change all that much very rapidly. But there were two strands of work that were considerably more frequent. Firstly, there was filling in the gaps, because of course the initial charts would look at what the soundings had given you and the layout of the various coastal features and so forth. But it's very difficult to find, say, an uncharted underwater reef or rock with a sounding line. You tend to either find it by hitting it or not, or if you're really lucky, you might see signs of it at low tide. So once the broader surveys had been done, drilling down into the details and finding these smaller details was an ongoing activity, which could then be added to existing charts. Then you have the more detailed charts, like, for example, the chart of Manukau Harbour. Those would be updated on a more regular basis, in terms of, once a decade, or potentially more rapidly than that, or longer than that, depending on a few factors. One, how much need was there for a change to be mandated? So, for example, if you were talking about a major port, like, say, Portsmouth, where pretty much all the features were well known, and there was ongoing maintenance work to keep certain dredged channels clear, then you wouldn't really have to update that very much at all. Conversely, if there was a port that perhaps had tidal conditions where there might be significant changes, but it was not inhabited and nobody really cared about it, then there might be a notation made on the chart that, significant conditions might cause sandbars, etc., to shift, but hopefully people would already understand that, being experienced mariners, but it wouldn't be revisited all that often. The balance point would be where a harbour was known to be relatively regularly used by shipping, particularly obviously military shipping, but also either because it wasn't particularly heavily inhabited, or because it was very large, or because of very extreme tidal conditions and rivers flowing in and out and all this other stuff, or a mixture of all of that. Then at that point you have a harbour that's features might be changing quite considerably, even possibly every few years, and shipping is using it. Then you would have ships periodically revisit and resurvey the areas that were known to change and that would be of interest to shipping on a fairly regular basis. And from the sounds of it, you look at the kind of the overall layout of Manukau and the rivers that run into it, the various tides and currents that run into it, you can see why you'd need to update that particular map quite often. So it's a little bit of a moving target. So, for example, the Admiralty chart that shows the whole of the coastline in that area probably wouldn't be updated for 50 to 100 years, but a specific chart of the harbour, that might be updated every 5 or 10 years if it was known to be an issue. Warrant Officer Will asks, what is the closest that Britain has ever gotten during the time period the Channel covers to losing its status as a great naval power, and how did they bounce back? I think there were 2 points at which England and later the United Kingdom got to a stage where, butterfly wings flapping here or there could have led to the loss of its status. The first one would be the conclusion of the Anglo-Dutch War. Obviously, one of the most famous actions of that particular war is the Dutch raid on Chatham. Now, in that particular case, ironically enough, you can actually have credit for Britain not losing its great power or great naval power status. You can give that credit to the French, of all things, because France was, of course, acting in its own interests at the time, being very opportunistic, and towards the end of the Second Anglo-Dutch War, although the French at one point were actually allied with the Dutch, the French decided they were going to take a chunk of what was then the Spanish Netherlands, which of course the Dutch saw as their own Netherlands, and kindly keep your French hands off of it. And so when the French decided we're going to invade part of the Netherlands, suddenly that was a somewhat more existential threat, because the British could threaten the Dutch at sea. They could, fight back and forth over trade and colonies and so forth, but the English hadn't shown any particular inclination to actually invade the Netherlands, which is what the French were now doing. And that accelerated rather dramatically the Dutch willingness to come to terms, obviously favourable terms for them, with the English, because obviously they needed to focus their time, effort, and money on a land army to repel the French. And simultaneously, because of the French threat, it was no longer in the Dutch interest to weaken Britain, or England at that point, quite as much as they might otherwise have wanted to, because then England was a potential ally against France. So you wanted to weaken them just enough to make it clear that they'd lost the war, and just enough that perhaps they wouldn't be an immediate threat to the Dutch fleet shortly thereafter, but strong enough that if you then offered them an alliance against France, and obviously, England's not really going to miss an opportunity to kick France every now and then they would actually be a useful ally that the French would have to worry about. And so that combination of factors meant that, if France hadn't gone after the Netherlands towards the end of that period, there's a fairly decent chance the Dutch could have continued to utilize the advantage they'd gained by the raid on Chatham and keep up pressure on the British and perhaps English and force them into far more favourable terms for the Dutch. The other circumstance would be towards the end of the American War of Independence or American Revolution, because at that stage it had gone from a colonial rebellion to pretty much everyone with a grievance against Britain, because it was Britain by that point. And let's face it, that's a very, very long list in the 1700s. They had all taken the opportunity to give Britain a bit of a kicking. So colonies in the Caribbean were being taken. Obviously, the 13 colonies were rebelling. Gibraltar was under siege. And the Royal Navy was having to fight a global war where it was, collectively speaking, outnumbered, and obviously a fight across multiple theatres. So things weren't looking very good. And at that point, if Britain had been forced to concede on unfavourable terms to everybody who was fighting against it, those terms may well have included a significant reduction in the power of the Royal Navy. But what ended up happening there, what kind of allowed the Royal Navy to bounce back, was the fact that almost at the last minute, you have a series of naval battles in the Caribbean, which go in Britain's favour and kind of turn the tables in that entire theatre. Gibraltar, improbably for the time, resists the Great Siege of Gibraltar and holds out, and the siege is broken and lifted. And the fighting in India doesn't go entirely France's way, so Britain still has a fairly strong hold foothold in that area. And suddenly, with the Spanish fleet on the back foot, the French fleet on the back foot, etc., it became more a case of, okay, well, we can now negotiate with the Americans for their independence, but they have to leave Canada alone. And broadly, although not in fine detail, but broadly with the French and the Spanish, it eventually came down to let's all go back to how it was before, with a few minor colonial exchanges, which put Britain in a position to then obviously reset, rebuild, etc., etc. But if it hadn't been for those key victories right at the end of the overall war, Britain could have been in a very, very bad position going into peace negotiations. Explicitly Implicit asks, if you were to construct a ship of the line, but you could source wood of every tree species from across the world, which woods would you use and why? Assuming that I have modern woodworking tools available, and you'll see why that's as important in a minute, I would probably still go with the old traditional ash or elm for the keel, because you want a wood that's pretty strong, but also relatively flexible and fairly resistant to rot, and ash and elm pretty much are ideal for that. They tick all the boxes. You could use oak of varying descriptions, but it's not as flexible. And you could use more flexible woods, but you don't want it to be too flexible, and so on and so forth. For the framing, however, I would probably go with live oak. That's the same kind of wood that was used in the framing of the USS Constitution, for example. It's obviously a species of oak, but it is a very, very strong and tough species of oak, and makes for good frames, as evidenced by the survivability and survival of the Constitution, amongst other things. For general planking, however, so the hull timbers. That is why I specified having modern tools, because for that I would use Australian Jarrah wood. And yeah, anyone who knows anything about Jarrah and has had to deal with it with anything other than, full-on power tools they're not having to pay for is probably crying into their drink right now, because Jarrah is an absolute pig to work with, purely because it is hard as nails, sometimes literally, once seasoned. But it is extremely strong. It's extremely rot resistant. It's, the perfect wood to make the outer hull of a ship of the line out of. You could actually, with the thickness of wood you'd use on a ship of the line, with Jarrah, you could actually get to the point where you legitimately might be proof against a good number of incoming shots. And as I said, it's incredibly resistant to rot, which is going to help, and marine life and so forth, which is going to help hugely keeping the ship fast and low maintenance. The only downside is that if you were using Age of Sail era tools, you would have to cut the timbers when the wood had been freshly cut down, because otherwise you just weren't going to cut it. It gets very, very hard once it's seasoned. But that would give you an absolute brick of a ship of the line. And it would last forever and a day as well, which is always good. For the masts and yards, I would probably go with fir. There is a lot of discussion these days about using spruce, but fir is that little bit stronger. So on the scale of a ship of the line's mast, I think the fir would be preferable, which is also what almost everybody tried to get their hands on. There are various species of pine you can use if you can't get your hands on good quality fir, but since I've got access to anything and everything, then I would use that. Of course, if you want backups to that, then obviously there's pine and possibly some of the better spruces instead of for your masts. For the hull, if you don't want to inflict pain and suffering on anybody who's working with the planking, you could go with white oak or regular European oak. White oak is slightly tougher, but it's much of a muchness. They're pretty good woods. Or you could go the Spanish approach and use mahogany. That's also a dense, strong wood, although there's not a lot of it left these days. And you'll also find teak is quite a useful general shipbuilding wood that could be used in almost anything except maybe masts, albeit there is discussion about how poisonous it could be if it starts being flung around in splinter form. But there were a number of ships built in India purely out of teak, which were generally viewed as quite useful, because again, it's quite rot resistant, so that would be another potential wood to use. Scott asks, what would have been the most likely redesign to US cruisers to have accommodated torpedo tubes, either in a pre-World War II paper design or in a mid-war moment of clarity? Would it have just involved sacrificing a 5-inch 38 mounting amidships? I think given the way US doctrine was going prior to World War II, the most likely points at which you'd see torpedoes retrofitted into existing US cruiser design or ongoing US cruiser design would probably be late 1942, because you've got the series of battles around Guadalcanal, you've got Japanese cruisers making a quite considerable use of their torpedoes at night, and I think if they'd had either a little bit more success, or potentially if some of the reports of the Japanese cruiser torpedo success had been read with a little bit more panic and so forth in the upper echelons of the US Navy, that probably would have been the tipping point, if you like, because then US Navy designers and officers would have been going, well, hang on a minute, clearly some part of our doctrine is wrong. We're sending our cruisers in to fight their cruisers have torpedoes, we're getting torpedoed, we can't respond to that. Yeah, we can respond with guns, but so can they, therefore we want torpedoes. That would be the most likely point of departure. But with that said, I think the US is far too dedicated to its dual-purpose secondary battery at that point to consider removing 5-inch guns in the face of an enemy air threat as well. I think it's far more likely that on existing types, like, say, the Clevelands, because radar is becoming rapidly more and more useful, I think what you might see is the elimination of some or all of the aircraft handling facilities on the stern, and them being replaced with torpedo tubes. Or perhaps the torpedo tubes just being added instead of it, depending on location of catapults, or maybe the catapult gets realigned or something like that. But that's less likely because the Clevelands, much like pretty much all other US cruisers at this point, are being loaded quite heavily with top weight as things like radar and additional anti-aircraft guns come in. So if you're going to stick torpedoes on, you're going to need to lose weight elsewhere. And given that radar is, to a certain extent, replacing scouting aircraft, you could see at least some ships have a kind of grapeshot style aft torpedo launcher layout. And the same thing might then apply to the Baltimores, because of course the Baltimores are being designed not restricted by treaty displacement limits, so are far more capable of carrying torpedoes. But again, I don't think they would sacrifice anti-aircraft firepower for that. If anything, they would sacrifice scout aircraft. Brian Stevens asks, in a recent Drydock, you quoted one of Britain's sea lords as saying something to the effect of, they can invade, but it won't be by sea. The exact quote is, I do not say, sir, that they cannot come. I say that they cannot come by sea. This makes great sense in World War I and World War II. When did this threshold get crossed and the UK become secure against invasion by sea, understanding there's never been a period in all these long centuries where one could boast absolute guarantees against invasion, still less serious raids, but invasion itself might be secured against? Well, the line is commonly attributed to John Jervis, aka Earl St. Vincent, in the early 1800s, just before Trafalgar. But in terms of a serious full-on invasion of the UK, or England, depending on whether you're pre or post-active union, I would say it probably tips over from more than 50% likely to less than 50% likely around the 1650s. Mostly, ironically enough, considering some of the early questions, thanks again to the Anglo-Dutch Wars, specifically the first one in this case. Because, as I've mentioned in other dry docks, that's kind of the turning point where the Royal Navy goes from a collection of personally owned royal vessels, which might have their fortunes wax and wane depending on the state of royal personal finances, over to a large state-controlled body. Also, in the early 1600s, you see Britain really picking up on international trade and therefore getting more money, which means it can afford a bigger navy, which is in part the reason for the First Anglo-Dutch War. But nonetheless, the main point of it is that by the 1640s, 1650s, particularly once you have the Commonwealth reorganisation of the Royal Navy, or the Commonwealth Navy is at that point, you end up with a fleet that is large enough that even at its lower points, it can still stand off in home defence against pretty much anyone who wants to come and have a go. And also, critically, is large enough that it has to be stored in more than one location. And the reason that's critical is because prior to that, you could either ambush the fleet to anchor, or you could face it in battle, and if you won that engagement, that would be it for the Royal Navy, and you could then invade, and pretty much the worst you have to worry about is the shore fortifications and whatever troops are on land. Once you get to this stage, however, you can face part of the Royal Navy in battle, but it's exceptionally unlikely that you're going to face all of it. And thus, even if you win the engagement that allows you to conduct a landing, enough of the Royal Navy will still be around to essentially cut you off, because once you're tied in place supporting troops landing, the Royal Navy has the advantage. It can attack your supply lines, etc., etc. Also, you start to see a greater population in the UK, as well as a more systemic development of internal fortifications, which combined with the Navy also severely limits where you can land and makes where you land not only a more limited choice, but a much more difficult operation to start with. Now, yes, you can obviously pull off small raids and odd landings here and there, but the key thing is that you can't stick around to exploit those, because either, depending on the size of your fleet, the Royal Navy will show up and beat you into submission, or it'll savage your supply lines, and then your soldiers will not be able to continue their campaign. And then by the time you get to a point where perhaps you could theoretically face the majority of the Royal Navy in battle, like, say, in the pre-dreadnought period or World War One, at that point the Royal Navy is too big for you to really overcome, especially in a direct assault landing consideration. But I think one of the key elements to all of this is really the exploitation of population increase in and defence of the southeast of England, because, as I will hopefully be showing people in an upcoming video in the next few months, invading the southeast of England, which is the easiest bit to access from the continent, is possible if you're William the Conqueror, but around about the late 1500s, early 1600s, it starts to become basically a really, really, really dumb idea. It's possible just about maybe to do it in the early Tudor period, so when the French fleet shows up off the Isle of Wight for the Battle of the Solent, for instance. But by the end of the Tudor period and beginning of the Stuart period, and from then on, it's pretty much a no-go, which is kind of why most invasions or potential invasions that have been planned ever since either don't land there, or if they have planned to land there, they haven't worked very well. Alex Moskovitz asks, it seems every other modern warship is a procurement disaster when a ship is some combination of delivered years late, wildly over budget, or lacking key capabilities. How common were procurement disasters during the period the channel covers, and how did the rate change between the age of sail and the age of steam and steel? There definitely were quite a few procurement disasters in the period the channel covers, but in terms of those three key categories that you mentioned, so either a ship arriving perhaps 2-3 years after it had been promised to arrive, or it costs exponentially more than was calculated, or bits of it are missing that are really vital. While they do happen, they are considerably rarer as a proportion of major projects compared to these days, at least in the Western world. I don't know enough about procurement operations in China or Russia these days to make a comment one way or the other there, but nonetheless. But I think there are two fairly major reasons for this, and how prominent these factors are very much has a direct relationship on how many ships are procurement disasters or not in a given time period. And unfortunately, there isn't a particular rate change between the age of sail and the age of steam and steel. There are periods in the age of sail where some ships are hilariously over budget, late, and far less capable than promised, and there are periods where pretty much everything seems to come roughly on time, or the ships are actually better. And similarly in the age of steam and steel, although it is, broadly speaking, somewhat less common, at least in the major navies, in the age of steam and steel. Now, as I said, two main reasons. First reason, accountability. Back in the day, depending on the exact time period and nation you're in, if you were found to be the cause of something like that, you could at minimum expect significant national shame, to the point of, literally becoming persona non grata, a pariah on the streets, people refusing to do business with you, people you might already be doing business with terminating their agreements. Not quite damnation memoriae, but very close to. And it could escalate from there. There could be fines, there could be prison terms. If you really screwed up and you were in a particular time period, you might even be executed for treason. I have a feeling those kinds of things might have a slight more motivational factor on things these days, because those kind of things unfortunately just aren't done anymore. The other major reason that kept things under control a lot of the time, especially, I would say, in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, in at least the larger shipbuilding nations, was the presence of state-controlled assets. So if we take the Royal Navy as an example, you can see repeatedly, on average, if you look at armoured cruiser production, battleship production, etc., especially in the run-up to World War One, ships that are assigned to be built at the Royal Dockyards which obviously tend to just be interested in building ships, because, at least in theory, the state isn't interested in just blowing large amounts of money pointlessly in their own assets, because it's just circular money. It's to a certain extent, apart from the wages to the workers, and that's the bit that loses the state money, so they obviously don't want that to extend too much. But anyway, the royal dockyards tend to turn out their ships pretty much on time and on schedule unless significant exterior factors intervene. But when you look at ships of the same class that are being built in the private yards, some private yards will, roughly speaking, match what the royal dockyards are doing. Other yards will take considerably longer than the royal dockyards. And there's extensive correspondence back and forth where private yards are constantly going, no, we need to build the ships for a longer period of time, which of course means we're employing people for a longer period of time on this project, which means you need to pay us more. And also, there's cost overruns and complications and blah, blah, blah. All the stuff that you've probably heard a million times before in the modern world as well. But at that point, the Royal Navy was usually able to turn around and say, well, hang on a minute. You're telling us it's going to take, let's say, 2.5 years to go keel to commission on a battleship. If that's the case, and you're going to swear blind that there's nothing you can do, you have to pay us for 2.5 years, and there's all these little cost overruns as well from faults in the design data, why exactly has HM Devonport been able to churn out exactly the same ship in 2 years with none of these problems, using the same set of plans? Awkward silence ensues, and then the prime, we'll have that battleship to you ASAP. Because if they don't, then that might threaten the potential of them getting awarded future contracts, because certainly in the run-up to World War I, not all of Britain's shipbuilding capacity was utilised, so if one shipyard was dragging its heels and seemed to be profiteering, well, there were plenty of other shipyards that might get the next set of contracts. That acted as a great motivator to reel in the worst of the corruption that could occur in private yards, who were obviously more interested in some cases in making money off of national defence than actually providing the tools of national defence. And that's in somewhere like the UK with a fairly established shipbuilding industry. In some nations it was considerably worse. I've mentioned in several videos that, for example, in Russia, around about the same time period, some private shipyards, this being pre-Bolshevik Revolution, were quoting 2 or 3 times the price and probably half again as long a construction time as the state shipyards, at that point the royal shipyards, were saying they could do it in. And again, that was used as basically a cudgel to browbeat the private yards into going, yeah, we're cutting out the bulk of that extra corruption that you're putting in there purely to profiteer. These days, on the other hand, there might only be 1 or 2 shipyards that you could go to in order to get your warships built, depending on whichever nation you're in, and they're usually in private hands, so if they want to skim and make money off of you, they will, and there's precious little you can do about it. Vokir asks, how effective and widespread was the use of Greek fire at different points throughout the Byzantine Empire? It seems to me that in later years, some of its presence and effectiveness had waned. Is that correct? Certainly, towards the end of the Byzantine period, the presence of Greek fire seems to have waned, and indeed it disappears before Byzantine rule does. The effectiveness, to a certain degree, you could argue maybe had reduced a little bit, but that was largely because everybody had just decided if you see a dromon with a siphon on it, you stay the heck away. Which, okay, yeah, if you stay away from the giant flamethrower, you don't get set on fire, but considering that the way you want it to go is through the dromons, and or the point would be to destroy the enemy fleet, and the best way of doing that is getting up close and personal and boarding them, and, well, if you do that, you get set on fire. You've reduced the effectiveness of the Greek fire, but the Greek fire, by its simple existence, has reduced your effectiveness quite considerably as well. So, swings and roundabouts there. There were certain countermeasures that gradually became a little bit more well known, but they were also hard to pull off because they required very specific materials, and that in and of itself, the layering of various hides soaked in various solutions, would have a negative impact on your own ability to fight in any case. So I wouldn't necessarily say its net effectiveness had waned, but perhaps its amount of deployment did. But it seems that either the knowledge or the materials that went into it were lost considerably before Byzantium or Constantinople itself fell. Although it's not entirely clear which was the first one to go, because we do know that various people did occasionally capture supplies of Greek fire, but even with the material in hand, they don't seem able to have perfectly replicated it, which indicates that either they didn't fully understand what they were looking at, perhaps because of something that was dissolved in the liquid that they didn't know, i.e., the secret of mixing it up, the knowledge of how to make it was the secret thing, or potentially that there was just one of those components. They could see it, they could say, okay, well, it contains this, this, and this, but also this, but we have no idea where to get this, whatever that is, probably some calcium something or other. But the Byzantine Empire had access to that in some rare naturally occurring deposit of some sort or other. Until, of course, they lost it, but then whoever they lost it to clearly didn't understand what they had overrun. And finally, Zhao Rita asks, the second half of the 19th century seems to have been a mad swirl of naval inventions and innovations, but the almost complete lack of major naval combat means there wasn't much real-world testing. Was there any invention or ship or equipment in which time and money was spent, and then when it was finally actually used turned out to be a total or near-total disaster? Well, there's always poor old Vesuvius of the US Navy, the dynamite cruiser, because as it turned out, pneumatic gun technology hadn't quite advanced enough to be able to actually hit the broadside of a barn, to the point that the ship, although in theory, on paper, looking quite attractive, ended up being used as essentially a late 19th century version of a bomb ketch, just lobbing high explosive, generally in the vicinity of an island, because an island was about the smallest target you could expect to hit. But I would say the single largest issue or class, or whatever you want to define it as, that turned out to be a terrible idea, near total disaster if you like, is something I've mentioned in previous Drydocks, and that is what the British would term the third class cruiser. So you have the first class cruiser, which in British parlance could either really be a really big cruiser like Powerful or Terrible, the protected cruiser, or an armoured cruiser. Then you had the second class cruisers, which were protected cruisers, so they had a degree of speed, they had at least a protected armoured deck or turtleback deck, and a wide range of guns. And then you had the third class cruisers, which would be smaller, slower, less armament obviously, and they might have a thin protective deck, or they might not have much of anything in the way of meaningful protection. But they made a certain degree of sense in the middle of the late 19th century, where, as you said, there wasn't all that much major naval conflict, because as showing the flag ships and suppressing, people ashore whose most advanced technology was the spear, or in some cases perhaps the early gunpowder cannon, they were perfectly fine because they were just mobile artillery platforms which could outrange and outshoot pretty much anything that wasn't using late 19th century technology. But it turns out that in pretty much every war that was actually fought where these kinds of ships ended up being called into action, they were universally, whenever they ended up in actual combat, shot to pieces in extremely short order. I mean, you saw that in World War I, over down in the southwestern part of the Indian Ocean, but you would also see it in, for example, the Spanish-American War. There were a number of cruisers, quote-unquote, at the Battle of Manila Bay that were effectively of this type. If they'd been in British service, they would have been termed third-class cruisers, and they could offer basically no resistance to Dewey's formation. They couldn't run, they couldn't protect themselves, and they couldn't meaningfully fight back either. So realistically, they were just a massive waste of time and money. All they offered, even in peacetime, was the fact they could be built cheaply in large numbers and didn't need that many crew. But honestly, they're more like seagoing gunboats with ambitions, and at least gunboats had the advantage of being relatively difficult to hit because they were tiny, whereas a third-class cruiser was just about big enough to be hit relatively comfortably in a ship-to-ship duel, which was a duel that almost certainly was going to always lose. And that just about wraps us up for this week. Thank you very much for listening, everybody. And, well, it's closing in on the end of the year. It's getting dark out there, but hopefully everyone's feeling relatively okay, and we'll see you again in another video soon.